Who's really winning the trade war? Donald Trump is once again bringing global trade to the forefront of political discourse. With a bold and provocative statement, he claimed that Mexico and Canada live off the United States, and accused China of exploiting American wealth and innovation. These declarations are not casual. They are part of a larger strategy, reigniting the trade war that he initiated during his first presidency and positioning himself as the defender of American sovereignty in an increasingly multipolar world. Behind this discourse lies a concrete policy: high tariffs, protectionist measures, and pressure campaigns against foreign competitors. Trump insists that these tools are essential for reindustrializing America, recovering manufacturing jobs, and cutting dependency on China. He presents them as a matter of national pride, as a kind of economic patriotism aimed at putting America first. But what happens when that rhetoric meets reality? Let's start with the basics. Tariffs are taxes imposed on imported goods. In theory, they make foreign products more expensive, encouraging domestic consumption and boosting local industry. In practice, however, the effect is far more complex. Most economists agree that tariffs ultimately raise prices for consumers and businesses alike. They don't punish foreign producers directly. Instead, they hit American importers, manufacturers, and families at the checkout line. During his first term, Trump imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, triggering retaliatory measures from Beijing. What followed was a sharp escalation in tensions. Chinese tariffs on American agricultural products, technology bans, and increasing scrutiny on companies like Apple and Tesla operating in China. Despite the dramatic headlines, the trade war didn't bring the manufacturing renaissance Trump promised. American companies didn't rush back home. Instead, they restructured their supply chains, shifting production to Vietnam, India, Mexico, and other countries. The result? The trade deficit with China shrank, yes, but the overall U.S. trade deficit remained high. The United States continued to import massive volumes of goods. They just came from new suppliers. And China? The Chinese economy certainly felt the pinch. Exporters struggled. Growth slowed temporarily. But Beijing responded by doubling down on domestic innovation, investing heavily in strategic sectors such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and green energy. It also sought to expand its sphere of influence by signing new trade agreements, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and strengthening its ties with countries in Africa and Latin America. In short, China adapted. It reoriented itself. And it began preparing for a long-term rivalry with Washington. Meanwhile, the costs of the trade war piled up at home. According to a study by the Federal Reserve, U.S. companies and consumers bore almost the entire burden of the tariffs. Manufacturing jobs did not return in significant numbers. Instead, many small businesses faced increased costs, forcing them to reduce hiring or raise prices. Farmers, especially in the Midwest, saw demand for their products drop, prompting the federal government to launch billion-dollar aid packages to soften the blow. So, again, we must ask, who is really winning? Trump's supporters argue that the trade war was a necessary wake-up call. For too long, they say, the United States allowed China to rise unchecked, stealing intellectual property, manipulating its currency, and flooding global markets with cheap products. In this view, tariffs were not just economic tools, but instruments of geopolitical correction. But critics counter that this strategy has backfired. Rather than weakening China, it pushed the country to become more self-sufficient and assertive. Rather than protecting American consumers, it increased their cost of living. And rather than building alliances, it alienated traditional partners, many of whom also suffered from U.S. trade restrictions. What makes the current situation even more complex is the broader global context. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted supply chains across the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent shockwaves through energy and commodity markets. Climate change is forcing a rethinking of industrial policy. And now, with Trump back in the White House and openly doubling down on protectionist rhetoric, the global economic system is facing renewed turbulence. Let's not forget, the United States is still the largest economy on the planet, and what happens in Washington has ripple effects across the globe. When Trump speaks of decoupling from China or imposing 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, as some of his advisors suggest, investors, governments, and companies around the world take note. The risk is not just a slowdown in trade, it's a fragmentation of the global economy into rival blocs. At the same time, America's neighbors are paying close attention. Canada and Mexico, as key partners in the USMCA, the updated NAFTA agreement, depend heavily on access to the U.S. market. Trump's comment that they live off the United States has raised eyebrows in Ottawa and Mexico City. It signals a willingness to put even long-standing alliances under review if they're seen as unfair or unbalanced. But are they? The reality is that trade relationships are interdependent. American factories rely on Canadian raw materials and Mexican labor just as much as Canadian and Mexican businesses rely on U.S. consumption. It's not a matter of one country living off another. It's a complex web of mutual benefit. What Trump seems to be offering is a simplification of that web. A narrative in which the U.S. is the victim, the rest of the world is taking advantage, and only tough measures can restore balance. That narrative resonates with many voters, especially in regions hit hard by globalization and automation. It plays well on the campaign trail. But it does little to address the structural causes of economic inequality, automation-related job losses, or the shifting nature of global power. Let's also talk about Europe. The European Union has watched this trade war with concern. On one hand, it shares some of the U.S.'s criticisms of China, particularly on issues like state subsidies and intellectual property theft. On the other, it fears the collateral damage of an all-out economic conflict. If Trump escalates tariffs, European exports could be caught in the crossfire. And if the global economy slows down, everyone suffers. In the end, this is not just a US-China story. It's about how nations navigate a world where economic interdependence is both a strength and a vulnerability. It's about how political leaders use trade policy to project strength at home and abroad. And it's about how citizens, workers, consumers, business owners, end up paying the price for geopolitical chess moves they can't control. There's also a technological dimension to this story. Much of the tension between the US and China revolves around who will dominate the industries of the future. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, electric vehicles, biotechnology. These are not just economic sectors, they are arenas of strategic competition. Tariffs, in this sense, are only one weapon in a much larger battle for supremacy. As the 2025 presidential campaign heats up, we can expect trade policy to become a central theme once again. Trump will likely continue to present himself as the only leader willing to stand up to China, to defend American workers, and to challenge a global system that he sees as rigged against the U.S. But voters, and the world, should ask deeper questions. Do tariffs really protect jobs, or do they just raise costs? Can a global power retreat behind economic walls without losing influence? And most importantly, in an interconnected world, is it even possible to win a trade war? What we do know is that these policies have consequences, long-term ones. They reshape industries. They strain alliances. They change the way companies plan, invest, and grow. And they test the limits of economic nationalism in a time that desperately requires cooperation to face common challenges. In short, behind Trump's aggressive rhetoric lies a much more fragile and complicated reality. One in which the United States must choose between confrontation and coordination, between short-term headlines and long-term stability. And in that choice, the future of global trade and global peace may well be decided. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you next time.